There's a couple of terms that you need to become familiar with as you start to consider why you are the way that you are. The first term is the self-concept. This is defined as the relatively stable set of perceptions that you hold for yourself. So these are different than your personality traits. They are different than even your self-esteem traits that you hold for yourself. Your self-concept tends to develop until you are about the age of 25, where it goes through a refining process that will lend to your eventual identity. Self-concept is relatively stable, but it is something that can change and you have control over. There's self-esteem, which are the evaluations of your self-worth. And self-esteem is how you feel about your self-concept. So the evaluation, and they've done studies on this and found that people who have a positive cycle for self-esteem, meaning that they have a high self-esteem to begin with, will tend to have positive thoughts and be able to create a desirable behavior at the end because of those positive thoughts. So all of that reinforces itself and lends to a more positive outcome. People who have a negative cycle in their self-esteem, meaning that they have a low self-esteem to start with, tend to have negative thoughts, and which produces undesirable behavior and then negative thoughts again, just feeding back into this cycle. They've also found that people with positive self-esteem tend to evaluate other people more positively, and those with negative self-esteem see others' negative qualities first. Then there's the self-image. These are the characteristics that you believe that you possess, which may have root in your personality and some of the biological traits that you've noticed. They tend to be influenced by your family and surrounding environments that you were brought up in. And what you believe that you possess tends to create a self-fulfilling prophecy, making you possess those traits as well. So all of these three terms are rooted in biology. And we know from psychology that biology will account for as much as half of your communication because of your personality traits. So extroversion, shyness, assertiveness, verbal aggression, willingness to communicate have all been rooted in biology. There's the nature versus nurture argument, which would say that even though half of who you are is hardwired in your DNA, the other half of who you are is because of the environment that you were put in and the type of appraisal and feedback that you were able to receive. So both are important to take into account. So as your concept is developing and forming, we can look to Mead, who was a psychologist who developed a theory known as the symbolic interactionism. And this is the idea that you develop your self-concept from the feedback that you are receiving from others. This would take into the nurture aspect of who you are. And there's something called the Pygmalion effect, which is where they've studied and looked at how significant other people do influence the eventual self-concept. So if you are put into an environment where people are very negative and caustic, critical, and any of those sorts of terms, you will tend to develop personality traits that also mirror that type of an environment. And it tends to be significant others that influence this self-concept. The study that is most widely cited with this happened in a school system, and they took some teachers and had them create known perceptions of students, meaning that they would inform the parents or the students themselves or that they had a certain perception or expectation for those kids. And for the kids that they expected to do really well and told them such, the kids tended to perform as well as was expected, in some cases even more. For the students that they told, or either parents or somehow made it known that they did not have as high of expectations, those students did tend to perform to that same level and not perform as well. So we do know that this is with significant others, so you can be around negative people and not have it influence you, but that would be because you don't value their input as much. And there's also another term called social comparison. And this is how we determine how we measure up. And in this, we know that the answer to that question depends on who you are comparing yourself to and why. So we tend to look at things like and try to ask ourselves, am I attractive or not? Well, that depends on who you're looking at. Are you tall or short? Depends on who you're standing next to. So your direct reference group does create a social comparison to which you determine certain traits about yourself. If you are in a group of friends where getting a B is considered a really high grade, then you may be considered very smart because you got a B on the exam. If you were to be in a different reference group where only A's were considered very smart, in that social comparison you would be seen as less intelligent. So that reference group really does play a large part. So there's also another term developed by Charles Cooley called reflected appraisal. And this is the idea that in general, society is either an ego booster or an ego buster. We develop our self-concept reflecting the way that we believe that other people see us. So how we see ourselves is a direct reflection of the processing that we take from others and how we think they are seeing us at that time. And of course that, puts a lot of pressure on the reference group. And often society doesn't recognize that the way that we are presenting expectations and feedback to others can really have a formation of self-influence that's really hard to change. So we tend to do this all the time. Of course, you never know what someone else is thinking. So a reflected appraisal is all based on the bias and filters that are occurring in your own mind. And there may be other things going on there that are either creating a clear or a foggy picture of that reflected appraisal. There's a quote by Overstreet that states, "We are not only our brother's keeper in countless large and small ways, we are our brother's maker." A lot of research is being done currently on bullying and the effects of online media and the feedback that people are getting on their Snapchat accounts or other such places where perhaps people have thought that they can flame or be somewhat of a troll and not have it matter as much as if they were to say those same things in a face-to-face context. We know that this just simply isn't the case. Reflected appraisal comes from all sorts of different mediums, and it does have an effect on a person's development and a surety with their self-concept, which goes right into their identity eventually. So let's go into a little bit more depth about social comparison. We know that we're evaluating ourselves in terms of how we compare with other people, and this is all based on your reference group. So as I said, are you superior or inferior? Well, that depends on who you're looking at. Are you determining that you're attractive or ugly? What does your reference group look like? And that will help you know. Success or failure, intelligent or stupid, all of that depends on your reference group. Society creates a reference group for us as well through media. So are you comparing yourself to a Hollywood star, or are you comparing yourself to your immediate group of friends? All of that will determine how you view yourself. Same as or different from. So what do the group of people that you're around think about your ideas? If you're around people who like your ideas, you'll tend to conform and just keep creating those same sorts of ideas and find value in it. If you're around people who disagree with your ideas, you're not going to see value in that perspective. And it doesn't really, the determining factor is not the idea so much as the reference group and how they respond to your idea, which is really interesting. Just change reference group and you may completely change ideas. So what this comparison tells us about our self-esteem will depend on who we compare ourselves with and who our reference groups are. So let's look at a couple of pictures. I went online and Googled ugly people. And then these are just a sample of some of the pictures that came up on Google Image. And if you look at the images, you can tell there's probably some intentional facial expressions that have been changed, possibly, knowing that they weren't looking their most attractive. But this is what society would tell us is ugly people. I Googled beautiful people, and here's a sample of the type of images that I got. And you will recognize the Hollywood stars, I'm sure, but also notice kind of the photoshopping that is happening in these images. Airbrushing, the lighting. How many pictures do you think it took to get these sorts of images? And yet, this is what on the surface, society, or at least Google, would tell us are beautiful people. Just out of curiosity, I typed in beautiful real people, and I looked through the images until I got each of the stars represented in a literal photo. And here's some of the pictures of the same stars. You'll notice Halle Berry is a beautiful person, absolutely, but it's a different image than what was appearing at the top right corner of your screen. So in real life, we're all just real people, and yet the first thing that we look at are the superficial photoshopped images, and we create our reference group and expectations often based off of that. And we know, the Dove campaign and other sorts of media campaigns have been brought to society's attention because of this misconception and the effects that it creates, such as anorexia, going in to get needless surgeries, all sorts of issues and complications. So, I went on and found other images, beautiful real people, and these are some of the pictures that I found. And I want you to notice how different our views of beauty may be. If you take out the social expectations on that and create a reference group that's much more open-minded, everyone is beautiful. And any of these images could be of someone who we consider beauty. The image of the little girl sitting, you can't see as clearly, but her face is covered with freckles. And I love this image because I'm aware that in several reference groups, people have hated having freckles and thought that it was ugly or a skin disorder. And in other reference groups for the same thing, freckles, women and men alike will see it as a beauty mark, as something to be proud of, making them unique. And how they have determined from the exact same perspective whether or not that's positive or negative is completely dependent upon what people have said to them in their direct reference group. If they grew up in an environment where people said, "Oh, your freckles are beautiful, they're like angel kisses," they're likely to have thought that feature is something positive. If they grew up in a reference group where they were, compared to completely flawless skin, with nothing on it at all, and told that was beautiful, then in their reference group they will think, oh, then this is not beautiful. And it's this same item. It's the determining factor is because of the difference in reference groups. So there's a couple of characteristics with self-concept that we need to understand. First of all, our self-concept is extremely subjective. We have this foggy mirror syndrome that's going on. So you have a reference group and a reflected appraisal that's coming in at you. And like I said, you've got processes that are going on in your brain that are taking that information. And you may get information that's obsolete. You may be part of a reference group where nobody ever tells you that you're beautiful. They just don't. That's not something that your family does. And it doesn't mean that you're not. You may be getting distorted feedback. You may be in a reference group where your mom tells you you are the most amazing singer in this entire world, as does your aunt and brother. And so you go on American Idol and, perform and get told from a completely different reference group that no, you don't have any skill sets at all, which may come as a complete shock because of the foggy mirror that was set up for you. You may be in an environment where emphasis of perfection is very clear and prevalent, and bar none, perfection fallacies is one of the hardest to overcome, and it's negative in your life. There's nothing wrong with trying to strive to be better, but it's a fallacy to believe that you can be perfect. And when the emphasis is put on perfection, then taking yourself with a grain of salt, looking at life as this eventual path of progression tends to go down, and it's an unrealistic perspective that you hold for yourself, where failure is going to be inevitable because we will all fail. Perfection doesn't exist. And then the last is the social expectations. Just because you're in a social group where they will say it's okay to feel positive about yourself versus no, you need to always downgrade that a little bit, that may create some different expectations in your own mind for how you are actually performing, which may or may not be true. So just because you're bragging doesn't mean that you actually did as well as you think. And just because you will never give yourself a pat on the back doesn't mean that you don't deserve one. And our expectations for that are coming from the reflected appraisal and the foggy mirror that has been set up from that. Your self-concept will resist change. We have another term called cognitive conservatism. And this is where we will seek out people who are supporting our self-concept. It's a natural tendency for everybody. It's hard to put your beliefs and values in a group where you know that people will disagree with you. So we tend to seek out people who are going to agree with us. Now what that does is really bring into question truth. And if you really want to know if the way that you are perceiving something is accurate, look at who you're surrounding yourself with. Have you surrounded yourself with people who will for sure tell you the truth? Or have you surrounded yourself with people who are going to give you a confirmation bias? Are they just going to tell you what you want to hear because that's how they believe as well? And remember, that idea will be perceived differently just because of the reference group. And the truth of the idea should be something that you want to find out if it's accurate or not, especially when it comes to terms of self. And sometimes that you need to resist the idea of cognitive conservatism and surround yourself with different sorts of people to get an idea of how it would hold up in a different sort of reflected appraisal. There's sex, gender, and culture issues that need to be brought up with your identity and the way that you perceive yourself. In general, there's two boxes displayed on your screen. There's a blue box and a red box. And the blue box is representing low context culture, which Western liberal democracies such as the United States, Europe, we tend to be a low context culture. We value the individual. We value direct speaking non-verbally and also verbally, and we expect people to be goal-oriented and take care of themselves. Whereas in high context cultures, they will have a sense of identity that is tied directly to their community. So the way that they perceive themselves is just is tied directly to the way that the community perceives them and how they see their community. So these places are, a lot of Asian cultures would fit into this mold, Middle Eastern cultures, and the value of family and community is stressed above the individual. A lot of these communities, the kids are expected to go away and work or get an education, not to better themselves, but to come back home and help provide for that family structure. Another place to look at is where we put our elderly, and in a low context culture like the United States, we will put them in a retirement home. In a high context culture, family takes care of family. Absolutely. They are never out on their own. That's as important. That's more important than just that individual, that sense of community. And you'll hear me talk about low and high context culture throughout the semester. There's a lot of really interesting things that develop just because of those expectations and differences in culture. There's another with your gender and your sex and those types of expectations and how we develop our sense of self based on society's reflected appraisal of what a particular sex or gender should be doing. So if you look at this image, you see masculine and feminine characteristics represented. In general, women are, if you look at the female side of the picture, you see wide eyes, smooth skin, voluminous lips, and her expression in comparison to the masculine expression seems one of being open, able to be submissive, not something that's direct. In comparison, you look at the masculine image and you see just from his eye contact a direct focus and stare. You see more of a masculine jawline with facial hair, of course, which comes from testosterone. And we still expect attractiveness on both sides, absolutely, but the directness in the way that we expect you to communicate is based largely on the sex and gender that we are able to identify. Now, the interesting thing is that we know that the gender of your brain can be different than the gender of your body, and this can be in extreme measures, meaning that you absolutely consider yourself a different gender, or it can be just that you are more of a masculine communicator, for example, in a female body. And there's been some interesting studies done by this at BYU, even within our own state, and they found that if you measure the testosterone in a person's body, you can determine a lot of things about them, including the way that they communicate. And Men with low testosterone tend to be more feminine communicators. They tend to be more empathetic, understand emotions better. They tend to be able to create conversations and understand the multiple complexities that are being expressed non-verbally. And women can be masculine communicators, where they are very direct. They're less likely to get the subtle hints, just as a typical male brain would. So there can be a lot of differences there as well. You can't just take the outside appearance and say, well, because you are a man, this is how you should behave and what you should want out of life. And we'll talk about sex, gender, and culture a lot in the chapters. Been a lot of really good research bringing some of this to the forefront of science and helping us to understand and allow for a lot more differences in perspective, which is important. So let's move on to another concept, which is the self-fulfilling prophecy. With your identity, because it's tied so directly to your reflected appraisal and the foggy mirror that's going on, you have an internal sort of processing that's your self-fulfilling prophecy. This is where you make expectations and you tend to behave in such a way that those expectations will happen. So when what you expect will happen does, because you make it so, is the definition of self-fulfilling prophecy. And in general, what will happen is you'll hold some sort of an expectation for yourself. So let's take coursework, and this class in particular. Let's say you go into the class thinking, I'm going to do really well in this class. This is something I love. I know I'm going to do great at it. Because you hold that expectation, you are more likely to behave in accordance with that expectation. So because you think you'll do well and it's going to be easy for you, you will take that mindset into each of your assignments and complete them confidently, and the expectation coming to pass goes way up. So more than likely you will do well on all of your assignments. And because you've done well on your assignments, that's just going to reinforce that original expectation in the first place, telling you, yep, I'm going to do awesome in this class. Now, let's reverse that, and let's say that this is your first time online, you're really apprehensive, and you hold the expectation, there's no way I'm going to be able to juggle all of the assignments for this class. Because you hold that expectation, you are less likely to be able to organize your time and behave in accordance with the idea that, nope, I'm not going to be able to do it. So you don't turn in your assignments. They take longer for you to complete. It seems like it's an insurmountable thing for you to accomplish. And therefore the expectation comes to pass. Just like you thought, you weren't able to handle it. And that just reinforces the original expectation, making it happen. Now notice all of this starts at the very top with your mindset. So you literally have control of what will happen to you in your life if you'll understand the role that self-fulfilling prophecy plays. Just getting that specific visualization out there in the beginning will have a high likelihood that you will behave in accordance with that, which just fulfills the overall loop and makes it a reinforcement in your life, bringing what you thought into reality. And second of all, there's a whole other type of self-fulfilling prophecy. So, I mean, you may buy that, yeah, I can see how my mind does lead me to behave in accordance to, whatever my behaviors end up being. But there's also not just self-imposed prophecies, there are other imposed prophecies, meaning that if you surround yourself with people who hold an expectation for you, the Pygmalion effect comes into play, just like with those teachers. So they held an expectation for students to do well and let them know that. Because they held that expectation, those students behaved in accordance with the expectation. Because they behaved in accordance to it, it came to pass, which just reinforced the original thought. So the other imposed self-fulfilling prophecy really shows you the power of your reference group and how important it is to surround yourself with people who are going to help you create the type of behaviors that you need in order to be successful. Also, it points to our role as society and the responsibility that we have to make sure that we are giving accurate expectations to people so that they can behave in a way that will positively reinforce and become a positive thing in their life, and not hold negative or unrealistic expectations of people. So you may be to a point where you can evaluate yourself and decide if you like yourself or not. You may be, younger and in your teenage years, not up to 25 yet, where your self-concept is really still fluid. Depending on where you're at, you may be able to change your self-concept. And even if it's developed into an identity, you can still have some positive influences, but it will be harder to change your identity than it is to change your self-concept. If you do want to change your self-concept, the first thing you need to do is have a realistic perception of yourself. You've got to create a picture and an image that's based on feedback, that's not biased from a reference group, and doesn't create a foggy mirror syndrome in your mind. Seek out truth by challenging yourself and going into different reference groups, challenging the feedback that you're getting and making sure that it's realistic as possible. You should stay away from the extremes in good and bad. If you're feeling those extremes being represented in your reference groups, chances are there's a bias coming into play. So try to avoid that, and then recognize inaccurate feedback. You got to have enough of a thick skin that you can recognize, perhaps your mom will always love what you do and think that it's the number one thing in the world. But that may not be accurate. Same thing if someone is super negative to you. That could be an inaccurate feedback that you're getting. They may be jealous. They just may not like you. And so their feedback comes from a biased perspective, making it inaccurate. You should have realistic expectations of yourself. Are you judging yourself against your own growth, or are you judging yourself against the behavior of others? Are you looking at social expectations and judging yourself against like Hollywood and some of these unrealistic ideals that society has set up? Or are you looking at what's realistic for you and what you want? And again, it's your own growth that you should be looking at, not expecting perfection, expecting progress. That's the goal in life. And then have the will to change. There's a couple of fallacies that we'll go through in another chapter, but one of the fallacies is revolves around the idea of the word can't. It's a helplessness fallacy. And you've got to really evaluate and listen to your inner dialogue. When you start saying the word can't, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And because you don't think that you can, you won't perform that expectation. And it'll reinforce the idea that you could never do it in the first place. And just by stopping with that first perspective in the self-fulfilling prophecy and eliminating the word can't, replacing it with can, is going to create the type of self-fulfilling prophecy that makes what you want to have happen in your life happen. Then you need the skill to change. You will need to seek out advice from other types of material. This class is going to help give you a lot of tips and tricks to get you started, but that should be a starting place. When you identify weakness in something with your self-concept, you should be motivated enough to seek out the type of reference material that will help you in that item. Let's say, for example, you discover in your emotional intelligence that you really struggle with anger and expressing anger proactively. Don't just understand, oh, I struggle with anger. Take the next step and seek out advice for how you can start implementing more particular strategies to handle that element in your self-concept that you would like to change. You should look at models, other types of, I'm not saying like models in, don't look at models and compare yourself, but observe different ideas and theories and look at people who are implementing those theories in their daily lives and set them as your model that you'd like to somehow implement characteristics from. And surround yourself with them. And by and large, we found that because of other imposed self-fulfilling prophecies and reference groups, that if you will surround yourself with the type of people that you want to be like, you will start to get those skill sets represented. If you stay in your reference group and don't surround yourself with other types of people, you are more likely to just keep feeding into that loop and never really progress or change. Your identity management. Now, once your self-concept starts to solidify, it becomes identity issues. And identity is a concept you should really pay attention to in your psychology classes. It's something that will cycle and change throughout your life. But it does tend to have two distinct elements, a private self and a presenting self. And your private self is how you are feeling about your self-concept. The presenting self is how we want other people to see us as our public image. And they can be completely different. You can have someone with a presenting self who seems very confident and assured, and their private self, their reflection of those behaviors, are extremely negative. They're harsh and critical. They beat themselves up and overanalyze, which are two completely different evaluations of self. So understanding these two things, seeing how you really feel about yourself, and then also seeing how you're coming across to other people can be a really nice key in understanding your identity. There's a couple of characteristics with identity management to be aware of as well. We tend to construct multiple identities, which is good and important. You may find that you're different with your family than you are with your friends. You may find that you're different at work than you are at parties. You may find that you behave differently in parties depending on who you know there. And all of that is normal, but it does take a measure of understanding. You need to focus on yourself enough to understand why you have a particular identity that's been constructed and what that means about you. And in general, it's a good idea to be who you are in as many environments as possible and not have a large difference in those actions. Identity management is collaborative. This means that how you see yourself will always be a collaboration with how other people are seeing you. And it's in general good to be positive, right? But you could see yourself as super positive, the most awesome person in the world, and other people could see you as really cocky. And you have to take into both accounts to find out what the truth is. So it should be a collaboration with yourself and the reference group that you're around. Your management can be deliberate or unconscious. We do tend to react to the way that other people behave to us, regardless if we want to pay any attention to that. So deliberate identity management is making conscious choices in your environments to behave a different way. Let's say that you found out on communication apprehension you tend to be pretty apprehensive in meeting new people. So you could have a deliberate management strategy where you go to different groups of people and you introduce yourself to someone new 3 different times. That will make you appear more outgoing, and that's a deliberate management strategy that you put into effect. You can unconsciously be communicating things about you as well, which will create a feedback loop. If you're more of an introvert, chances are unconsciously when you get into a social setting, you will tend to stay away from the center of the group. Sit instead of stand, cross your legs and arms instead of opening up your body posture, all of which unconsciously speaks about you and how you feel about being around other people. And it's something that's completely unconsciously done. Your identity management is going to vary by situation. So, and this, people always will say this, especially with communication apprehension. They'll say, well, when I'm around people that I really like, I'm really quite friendly. Really normal to have those types of differences. So the situation, of course, is going to create different reference groups. It's going to create different environments where this happens. So if you're in your room at home with your best friends, you will probably be very open and comfortable. If you're around your best friends at a party, you may not have the same level of comfort, even though you're still surrounded by those people because of the situation differences. People will differ in their degree of identity management. Some of the most conscious with identity management are actors. Those that are the most self-aware of the emotions that they are expressing and how other people can interpret those expressions. And they will tend to change the way that they behave and how they're perceived, dependent on that situation. And, they're high affection communicators, so they are able to perform really well. There's other people who are just really not aware of their identity and how they're coming across to others. And so they'll be in an environment and not realize that they are dominating the conversation, coming across as very antagonistic or something like that. So there's always a different degree of awareness. Anybody can learn the skills, though. And emotional intelligence, which is a quiz you'll take in chapter, I think it's assignment 4, that's something that everybody can improve on and gain skills in. So there should never be an excuse that, well, I just don't have a very high degree of identity management skills. You should strive to have better identity management skills throughout your life. So let's talk about identity management a little bit. There's a face-to-face identity management and computer-mediated identity management that you will need to have attention on throughout your life. Face-to-face identity management takes into account your nonverbal communication and learning how to hold yourself with confidence, open up your body language with voice and gestures really does tend to create an opening to how you see yourself. And understanding those nonverbal characteristics can be an important element in expressing yourself the way that you want to be expressed, and also in understanding the way that other people are talking to you and telling you things and what those messages really mean. That we'll talk about nonverbal communication in depth in chapter 6, so we'll really get into some of those elements a little bit later. But there's also computer-mediated identity management, and we are becoming more and more aware of how important it is that we develop the same sort of strategies that we're doing in face-to-face with our online identities. We're finding out that people are Googling us for job interviews and taking into account all sorts of feedback that may or may not be accurate, and how we respond to the feedback is important. The types of images that we're putting out about ourselves, even though your Facebook, you would think you can put whatever pictures you want representing your party life or your relationship, stuff like that. That identity that's created there may not be complete, and when an employer Googles your name and finds your Facebook profile and sees all of the parting images, may not get an accurate representation of who you are. And it's really important to take into account that your identity management online is an important thing to pay attention to, just as if you were choosing to only display those behaviors in a face-to-face context. And we'll talk more about that throughout the semester as well. It's important to understand identity management and honesty. So how are you being honest with yourself and with other people? What sorts of steps are you taking to make sure that you're not manipulating information to get a desired outcome? We tend to find out eventually. So in a computer-mediated situation and a dating profile, this is an easy place to look. So you may get by with saying that you weigh a certain weight, only putting, certain pictures that are flattering online. But the day will come when you'll meet that person and honesty will be on the table. And so creating an identity management strategy that allows you to put yourself in a positive light, but that's also well rooted in honesty is important. They've done studies with this and found out that people online actually prefer the honest profiles. They prefer when people look real and behave real. And that's the same way we are in face-to-face contexts. We appreciate honesty in self, and that's represented all the time. I put this link on the bottom of the screen. There's TED Talks I'll refer to often in this semester, during the semester. There's a lot of different expertise that has been kind of collected and reported on, and if you have any leisure time, you should Google Sherry Turkle's Alone Together talk on TED Talks. This is the link for that. It's an excellent presentation on face-to-face computer-mediated identity management and some of the things that they're finding out that's happening because of the fusion between the two, and also how we are keeping them separate. So if you have any free time, check that out. Okay, I'm going to go to the last part of the chapter now and talk about self-disclosure. This used to be in chapter 9 in previous editions. So if you have the 13th or 12th edition of this textbook, this information is in chapter 9. If you're in the 14th edition, they've moved it to the second chapter because it tends to go right along with identity development and maintenance. So with self-disclosure, first thing you need to understand is the definition. Self-disclosure includes information that's significant and wouldn't normally be known. It has to be given deliberately. So self-disclosure is not just information that people observe. It's something that you deliberately put out and try to let other people know about you. It tends to occur in dyads, meaning just like one-on-one. It doesn't tend to occur as much when there's a third wheel present. And we have a social identity that we'll put out there, right? And our social identity versus our personal identity are two completely different things. And the personal identity is where self-disclosure is really rooted. It tends to be incremental and relatively scarce. It doesn't happen all the time. It's exhausting, and it's pretty vulnerable. So it's best kept in a context of positive relationships. When you are going into a negative cycle, it's not the time to open up those deep secrets about yourself, because you don't know how the other person is going to respond, and you could easily be harmed. So there's a social penetration model that describes this really well, and it basically, it's also known as the onion theory. It's got two different dimensions. It's got the breadth, or the range of the subjects that are being discussed, and it's got a depth, which is where you go from impersonal messages to personal messages. And the measure of the depth of messages is by looking at the type of the information that's shared. So on the outside of that onion, if you will, you tend to express things like cliches and just stuff like that doesn't really mean a lot to you. It's just something that's somewhat observational, but also something that you that does express who you are. And then you get into another level that would be like your facts. So the things that you can't just kind of brush aside, it just is or it isn't. Then you get into your opinions, which are how you feel about the facts and cliches that exist about you. And then more importantly, you get to the feelings about those opinions. So this model, Altman and Taylor is who developed it, and here's another image, and just with kind of an explanation for what you could look at. So you've got the outer layer, which is like your biographical data, your age, your gender, what you go by and why. All of that is just an outer surface. It can be cliche information, have kind of some of those jokes and social expectations that we would make with that. So as I'm introducing myself with Melinda Biergard, I'm often going to say, yes, that's a difficult name, whatever sorts of jokes about guarding the beer or whatever. All of that is just kind of outside biographical data that you could observe and know about me. The second would be our preference. And so as we're getting into facts, this is really what you would prefer with clothes, food, music, anything like that. And usually, you have to ask somebody what kind of music that they like, or you have to make direct observations in the way that they dress in order to determine that. It's not just a superficial thing that you can make a stereotypical judgment about. And it's not to say that we don't just see people on this surface and create a cliche about them. You see someone that walks into a room dressed like a cowboy, you may create a stereotype, but that may not actually be accurate. And the factual evidence with their preference. Other things could be going on that made them dress the way that they did. So it's important to ask questions to get to that layer. And then you get to their goals and their aspirations. So here comes in their opinions about life and why people should behave the way that they do and why they tend to behave the way that they want to. Your religious convictions tend to be even more important than that. So your religious convictions and politics, religion and politics, you hear that often. You got to watch those subjects. And they do tend to be an inner layer and deeply rooted in a lot of nurture and possible nature elements for why they think the way that they do. And then you get into possibly their fears and fantasies. Fears are hard to open up for. You can see why that would be a center item. And it does tend to, fears will be something that you'll try to keep hidden until you're ready to open up and let other people know about that. So those really are feelings. And finally, your concepts of self and how you feel and why you think the way that you do, why you have the particular fears that you do. And all of that is rooted in all sorts of experiences that you've had in life. So the idea is that if you want to somehow get into a more intimate relationship with somebody, you need to go beyond the model of just staying on the cliches, staying on just the factual observations. You've got to start getting deeper into some of those intimate details that create who we are as a person. And the key with self-disclosure, the reason that we're bringing this up right now, is that self-disclosure is your key to understanding who you are and who the other person is. It is the basis of any strong relationship. You cannot have true intimacy without having true self-disclosure. And we are all trained differently in how we should express our feelings and emotions. So culturally and from a gender perspective, you may not feel like you should open up, or you may feel like you should open up about everything just because of the reference group and how you were brought up, and also because of some of the cultural expectations about opening up. And all of that filters into how you see yourself and how you self-disclose. And it's important in relationships to learn how to self-disclose similarly. So you don't have one person that's opening completely up, raw and bare, and another person who won't let that same type of information be shared. So reciprocity is really important with self-disclosure. There's another model to talk about with self-disclosure as well. This was developed by Joseph Luft and Harry Ingham. It's called the Johari window. And this you'll find out about in psychology as well if you ever take some of those classes. We have information about ourselves in that social penetration model that tends to fall in one of these quadrants. So if you look at the top, you've got information that's known to the self, not known to the self, information that's known to others and not known to others. And if the two cross, known to self and known to others, you tend to get open information. So because it's known to both parties, it's open. Everybody knows about it. So we can tell what your height is. We can tell some of your music preferences because that's what's playing in your car. It's just open information. Now there's other information that other people will know about you, but that you have not realized about yourself yet. And it's still a part of you. So for example, you may not know that you come across really shy. To you, you may think that you're outgoing, but to other people, they see that and they know that in social situations you are extremely withdrawn. So therefore, that information in those contexts is blind. You don't know about it yet. And it takes other people to bring that focus into you so that you understand that part of yourself. You know, a really easy one to look at is if you have bad breath. Other people are going to know that. You may not know it. So they have to help you understand. But of course, bad breath, that's on the outside of the onion. There's a lot of stuff inside that you won't know yet that other people can observe and know about you. And we have a responsibility with our reflected appraisal to help other people understand stuff that is true about them. Then there's stuff that you know, but that you keep way hidden, so no one else knows. So this is known to self and not known to others, where it will be hidden. And we can choose to keep things hidden about ourselves, even in committed relationships. And there's a dialectical tension that we'll talk about, and there's openness versus privacy. Should you have to be open in all things, or is it okay to keep things private? That's something that will depend on your particular relationship and how you function and kind of the expectations that you set up. In general, it's fine to have things that you keep hidden. It's important to have a sense of self that you don't have to just share with everyone, but that also can be easily abused. So be aware of the information that you're consciously keeping hidden. And then there's information that you don't know about and other people don't know about you. And this has a lot to do with who you are, but maybe you haven't even had an experience to bring that action out. So for example, what kind of a mother or father are you going to be? If you have children, you'll know. If you've never had children before, it's unknown. And no one else knows either. We can have ideas, but we really don't know how we will feel about being a mother until we go into that sort of experience. So there's some benefits of self-disclosure that if you will open up to other people, not only will you have a higher amount of relationship success, but you'll also have some of these benefits. The first is catharsis. Just by getting things off your chest, you'll tend to feel better. And that's the benefit of therapy right there. Just talk therapy. Getting it out in the open will make you feel better. Reciprocity. If you tend to open up about information, other people will tend to open up to the same depth, especially if they care about you. If you open up deeper and you see that the other person did not respond in kind, there was no reciprocity occurring, that's a really good indication of where the relationship is. And that other person is not feeling as comfortable doing that with you yet. So it's, you don't want to just keep going deeper and deeper if you don't see the reciprocity happening. There's self-clarification, which goes into identity management. So by opening up about ourselves, we give other people the chance to help us get that blind information moved over to open so that we understand really who we are. And it's by opening up and discussing it with someone that you trust that often you'll get that clarity. There's self-validation. So when you open up something that you thought about yourself and then you find out that other people see that too, that can help you really understand that aspect and validate that behavior so that it becomes something that's ingrained and you can work with that. But if you never opened up about that thought, you're not going to get the validation to help it become, another imposed self-fulfilling prophecy or whatever the case may be. Building and maintaining relationships is another benefit. So as I've said, marriage therapists will say this all the time. You have got to have a measure of self-disclosure in your relationships, something that is there just between the two of you and that's different from the way that you are with someone else. People cheat because they tend to get into relationships, even if there's not a sexual component yet. They can get deeper in that self-penetration model than what they do with their partner. And that depth of relationship is really an important thing to watch. And the deeper that you are in a relationship with somebody, the more important that relationship will be. And you want to have the most depth and the most breadth, the most different types of topics covered and disclosed with your committed partner. That should be your goal. And then last, social influence. We tend to trust people who open up to us more in society. So your teachers, your any religious person that you tend to go to for advice, there's a certain amount of social influence that goes with that self-disclosure activity. And so it's positive. If you're in the teaching profession, you should try to open up a little bit more with your students. If you are in any sort of therapy or any of that, you should be able to understand, get to the depth, and then somehow, even if you're not talking the same way about your own relationship, show that you understand that depth, that you're also being as open with that person as you can. So and there's also risks of self-disclosure. You think that it's good just to do this all the time, everybody should self-disclose, but that's not the case. You may be rejected because you opened up. And if there's not the same sort of reciprocity going on, it's an easy rejection point. You've just told them about your most important fear, and they responded with, well, that's weird. And then your trust level goes way down. Chances are that's going to harm your relationship because they weren't ready yet. If you've ever been told that somebody loves you and you don't feel the same way yet, you know how that rejection comes into play. It can create a negative impression. So they weren't ready to hear it. Maybe there's something that you're working on with your fears or an issue that you have. And because you brought that to the surface or opened up a little bit so that they could see that, they are able to see something about you that they may not like. And it may result in a negative impression. There's nothing you can do to control that. There may be a decrease in the relational satisfaction because they may not like that part of you, may not end up being something that they want to have in their relationship. And you'll have to deal with that. Is this something that you want to overcome, or is it something that's just about you that you need people to accept? And that takes a lot of introspection to determine what you'd like to do. The healthy thing is not just to cover it up and not let them see that part about you. It's important to understand what that part is and how it's interacting with your overall relationship. There might be a loss of influence because you've opened up and admitted to something. You may not have the same credibility that you did before, as before they knew that about you. And it might hurt them because you opened up. So, if you've cheated on your spouse, you can easily see loss of influence whenever you're talking about issues such as trust or fidelity. You just don't have the same credibility anymore. That's just the fact of the matter. They may be hurt, and you'll have to deal with that. But again, I would say, especially in situations where there's a moral obligation to open up, it's better to open up and be honest about it than it is to just try to keep that information hidden. The thing is you don't know when hidden information is going to be known by other people. Sometimes other things happen that brings that to the surface. And that, by far, is more hurtful than the person that will open up before and let that person know what's going on. So before self-disclosing, you should ask yourself these 6 questions. Number 1, is the other person important to you? If this is a really important relationship, you know that you're committed to them. You know that self-disclosure is going to be in your best interest, even if it's hard to do. Number 2, is the amount and the type of disclosure appropriate? So are you looking at the balance between the two? Are you self-disclosing more information than you should because the relationship is, at a younger stage, or that other person is just not ready to hear the depth of it yet? Really watch the amount of self-disclosure and how you open up. 3, is the risk of disclosing reasonable, even though it might hurt the other person or you might lose influence? Do you need to do it? Is that risk worth it for the overall health of the relationship? Or are you opening up about things to somebody that you don't need to do because that relationship is not that important and the risks of harming that relationship are far greater? So, an example of that would be a teacher. You don't need to tell your class that you've had an affair, I'm sure. So the risk of disclosing and the effects of that perspective may not be that important for your class to know. Number 4, will the effect be constructive? Do you have a reasonable idea that because you self-disclose, it's going to aid your relationship? And if that's the case, go for it. 5, is the self-disclosure reciprocated? Have you been able to see that they are matching in your self-disclosure? That's, again, an important key. And number 6, do you have a moral obligation to self-disclose? If you are morally obligated to self-disclose because you're in a committed relationship or because society, has passed a judgment or something, you may just have no choice and need to open up to that person because they're a victim or whatever the case may be. Okay, I'll end with the alternatives to self-disclosure. If you decide, nope, not going to self-disclose, I answered those questions, doesn't seem like it's in my best interest, here's your options. You have these 4 things to do. If you don't want to self-disclose and you still need to respond in some way because they've asked you questions or something is brought up to the surface. So the first alternative is silence. You can choose when somebody addresses you about a certain thing, you can choose just to kind of be quiet about it, not really say anything, and let them come to their own conclusions. And sometimes silence is positive, actually. In the first chapter in your book, it talks about how silence is one of the most negative things that you could do if it's intentionally given to hurt the other person. So we use silence as a form of torture currently, and we'll isolate people out and not let them talk or communicate, right? So silence is not always positive, but it can be. Sometimes just taking a break, so let's say you're in an argument, instead of opening up when your emotions are really high, just being quiet about it, taking a break and not talking about it until the morning can be a really smart strategy. You'll find that your mind will cool down and you can think more rationally when the emotions aren't just flooding through your system. So silence is an option. You can choose to do it just for a short while or for a long while, and you just never talk about it. Lying is an option, and we do tend to lie a lot. Lying happens, especially with small white lies, all the time. Your book said that in one study, 130 subjects were asked to keep track of the truthfulness of their everyday conversations, and only 38.5% of these statements, which is slightly over 1/3, was totally honest, which is incredible. So the average lie rate is 3 fibs for every 10 minutes of conversation. So you're taking into account benevolent lies. You're looking at, which would be lies to benefit the other people. You're looking at lies that would save your face. So, instead of appearing negative, you're going to take a little bit of the truth and blow it up a little bit. All of those are still considered lies. And they're not accurate in the self-penetration model. You're taking truth and bringing it up to kind of even a cliche or a superficial level when you choose to lie. Sometimes lying and misleading does benefit the other person and it eases their potential pain, but very few of us would prefer to be lied to. So important to know. Equivocating is another option, and equivocating is where it's whatever you say has more than one meaning. It's not a lie. You haven't taken it and exaggerated. You've responded, but it's not really clear what you mean. So somebody comes to you wearing a shirt and you don't know that it really makes them look their best. And they say, well, what do you think? How does this shirt look? And you say, it's interesting. And that's your response. It's not a lie. It's not silence. It just could mean, interesting could mean a lot of different things. So that tends to be something that will buy you some time, but it doesn't really create a lot of clarity in the situation. So true responses are usually preferred the most. When they get really false, even if it has multiple interpretations, like you really thought that they looked awful and you said interesting, you're really bordering a lie in that instance. And then the last one is hinting. And out of the genders, stereotypically, female communicators tend to hint more than masculine communicators. And notice I'm saying female communicators, not just men and women, because if you are male and you tend to communicate more in a female manner, you will tend to hint more. So hinting is where you would have to observe their nonverbal communication as they say it. It's not really a lie. They are trying to let you know the truth through subtle means. Unfortunately, few of us, especially masculine communicators, will get the hint. And so it's like hinting is like diluted versions of truth. And you have to be really aware in order to understand where that truth line is. So you haven't disclosed, but you've hinted that there's a problem. You've hinted that you're afraid or something. And it tends to be a way to, again, evade the conversation and not have to self-disclose.